Petyr Baelish lingered on the threshold of a choice that would change the fate of the Vale, of Sansa Stark, and indeed of the Seven Kingdoms themselves. The high hall of the Eyrie stood silent in that moment, so high above the world that it felt like a place removed from all earthly concerns. Lysa Arryn's voice had echoed off the marble walls only seconds before, a shrill cry of jealousy and rage that startled the birds perched outside on the high ramparts. Her hazel eyes, bright with desperation, bored into Petyr's. She had seen something in him, something that told her she was on the brink of betrayal. She gripped Sansa's arms, nails digging through the thin fabric of the girl's sleeves. For Lysa believed Sansa was Elaine Stone, Petyr's bastard daughter. But the older woman's fears extended far beyond that simple ruse. She sensed that Petyr's affections, manipulations, and labyrinthine plots might not place her at the center. Lysa had always wanted to be the sun around which he orbited. Now that fear had grown to the breaking point. Sansa, trembling and unarmed, tried to plead for calm. The vicious tears in Lysa's eyes warned that reason would not easily find purchase in her mind, yet still Sansa tried. She implored Petyr with her gaze, begging him to intervene before Lysa did something rash. Lysa's hands clutched Sansa's shoulders even harder, dragging her toward the open moon door. Thin mountain air blasted upward from the gaping hole in the floor, which was framed in a half-circle of stone. The sky door led to a sheer drop of thousands of feet, straight down the side of the giant mountain that housed the Eyrie. At that height, the wind gusted with enough force to whip cloaks and hair about, and even a slight push was enough to fling a person into oblivion. Just moments ago, Lysa had threatened to toss Sansa out that door for the crime of seducing her beloved Petyr. In the real timeline, Petyr Baelish would have gently coaxed Lysa away from Sansa, only to whisper cruel words and push her through the moon door. But in this moment, in this turning of the wheel of fate, Petyr hesitated. He placed a gentle, steadying hand on Lysa's shoulder and did not whisper that final betrayal. Instead, his voice came out smooth as silk, yet edged with a concern that Lysa might take for genuine love. "My sweet, silly wife," he said softly, leaning toward her. "Let go of the girl. Come away from the edge." She stiffened, suspicion warring with her love for him, with the old longing that had shaped her since she was a young maiden at Riverrun. She still remembered how she used to watch Petyr from afar, how every small courtesy he paid her would leave her hopeful for more, how he would laugh with her sister, Catelyn, but how she believed that one day he would turn and see her in the same way. Now, she looked into his gray-green eyes, searching for some sign that he cared for her, that he did not see her simply as an obstacle or a means to an end. Her grip on Sansa loosened just enough for the girl to draw a ragged breath. Sansa, unsure of what might happen next, stood as still as she could, not wanting to provoke Lysa. Though fear thrummed through her veins, she found a sliver of relief that Petyr had not yet acted on the dark intention she had glimpsed in his gaze earlier. She had believed, for a fleeting instant, that she would watch Petyr murder his own wife before her eyes. His track record told her it was not beyond him. Perhaps something in him had changed. Perhaps her presence had pricked his conscience. Or more likely, Petyr was calculating that keeping Lysa alive served some greater purpose. Whatever the reason, Petyr's words poured over Lysa like a cool stream. "We should not quarrel," he went on, voice gentle. "Not now. This is a new start for us both. Lysa, we have each other at last." The eyes of the Lady of the Vale darted to Sansa, still shining with jealousy. "She is your daughter," she said bitterly, voice tight with frustration. "But you look at her as if she's not. It's in your eyes, Petyr. The same way you once looked at her mother, my sister." "Hush," Petyr soothed. "She's only a girl, and you are only exhausted, my love. Things are not as they seem." Lysa's features flickered, as though she was wrestling with the worst of her demons, and she finally moved her hands off Sansa. One last suspicious glance at the younger woman, and Lysa stepped back from the brink of the moon door. "Very well," she said in a near whisper. "I trust you." Sansa's relief was so profound that she could barely stand. The adrenaline rushing through her body left her knees trembling, but still she managed to stagger away from that gaping hole in the floor. Petyr slipped an arm around Lysa's waist and guided her away from the deadly opening. For now, at least, the storm was quelled. Sansa thought that perhaps the gods had intervened in those last seconds. Or perhaps Petyr Baelish was a cunning weaver of illusions who still needed Lysa's influence and armies. Whatever the reason, in that moment Lysa Arryn lived. And so began the departure from all that might have been. In the days that followed, the news that the Lady Lysa had nearly cast her niece, or so she believed Sansa to be, through the moon door did not spread beyond a small handful of servants, guards, and the few lords and ladies who lingered in the Eyrie. Petyr, ever the artful manipulator, soothed Lysa's nerves and kept her distracted with new plans for the Vale. She had wanted a wedding feast, had she not? She had wanted the Vale lords to witness her union with Petyr Baelish, to confirm that her son, Lord Robert Arryn, was in good hands. Petyr smoothly suggested that they arrange a modest series of feasts, enough to keep the Vale lords close and pliable. We shall show them that the Eyrie remains strong, and that Lady Lysa and I guide young Robert with a firm but loving hand, Petyr told her one morning. Sansa stood off to the side, her status in the Eyrie now ambiguous, but safer than it had been. She waited for any sign that Lysa might round on her again. But for now, the older woman treated her with stony civility. The memory of that night's near tragedy lingered behind her eyes, but Petyr's presence at Lysa's side offered some sense of reassurance, or perhaps caution. Lysa was not entirely rational, but neither was she foolish enough to openly defy Petyr now that they were wed. Lord Robert Arryn was rarely present at these conversations. The sickly boy spent most of his days in bed, complaining of headaches or a churning stomach. A rotating series of maesters attended him, trying potions and tonics to little effect. Sansa sometimes sat by Robert's bedside, telling him gentle stories of knights and tournaments, or how her home in the north had been before the war. Robert would cling to these fantasies for a time, but soon enough, he would whimper that his head ached again, or that he felt too weak to sit up. His mother, fixated on her new marriage, left him under the watchful eyes of the servants, while Petyr mostly regarded the boy as a piece to be maneuvered. Through Robert, Petyr exerted control of the Vale. And for Lysa, the only child she had borne after so many heartbreaks, Robert was a precious thing whose fragility fed her own sense of fear and paranoia. Time passed quietly in the Eyrie. The threat of the outside world, a world still racked by the War of the Five Kings, rarely breached the lofty heights of that fortress. Ravens brought tidings of King Tommen in King's Landing, of Stannis Baratheon's doings at the Wall, of the continued strife in the Riverlands. But for the Vale, at least outwardly, neutrality reigned. Lysa had refused to throw in with the war for so long, preferring the safety of her mountains. The Vale's knights remained formidable, the land largely untouched by the devastation that had scarred other regions. Perhaps that was Petyr's plan. Keep the Vale pristine, nurse its strength, and then use it when the time was ripe. Sansa observed him carefully, thinking of how he had once told her she was a piece on his board, how he had always loved her mother. In truth, Sansa did not know what Petyr Baelish's end goals were. He offered her kind words, expressed paternal concern for her safety, but she sensed the undercurrent of something else, something that might be an echo of his old obsession with her mother. Nevertheless, he had spared her from Lysa's wrath, and though that was hardly proof of benevolence, it was enough for her to quell her suspicions for the time being. She lived, and that was no small gift in these dangerous times. One morning, as the sun rose golden over the mountains, Sansa stood on one of the terraces overlooking the Vale below. Swaths of mist curled around the peaks. Her breathing felt steadier in the crisp air, though her heart never ceased missing the rolling hills of Winterfell. She was still so young, yet felt she had aged a lifetime since she left her father's house. That day, footsteps alerted her to someone approaching. She turned to see Petyr strolling onto the terrace, hands clasped behind his back. He'd left Lysa inside the solar, presumably embroiled in some letter writing or plan-making. He paused beside Sansa, letting the mountain winds tug at his dark hair. His gray-green eyes flicked over her. "You seem well this morning, my dear." She inclined her head, not quite daring to smile. "I am managing." He gave a small laugh. "That is all any of us can hope for. I trust you are settling in more comfortably now." She nodded, a swirl of conflicting emotions churning in her belly. "Thank you for intervening that night, my lady aunt." "Yes." She was a bit perturbed. Petyr's lips curved in a half-smile. "But worry not, she has come to her senses, at least for now." Sansa could not help but remember how quickly Lysa's mood had turned murderous. "What if she will not harm you while I live?" Petyr said swiftly, his hand alighting on hers in a gesture that might have been fatherly if Sansa did not sense something else behind it. "Focus your mind on the future, Elaine." He paused, half-lidding his eyes. "I must still call you that, for safety's sake. To the wider Vale, you are my bastard daughter, and it must remain so until circumstances allow otherwise." That was the ever-present arrangement. He'd sworn to keep Sansa's true identity hidden, to protect her from those who would deliver her to the Lannisters and from the Lannisters themselves. She was grateful if cautious about the cost. She lowered her eyes. "I understand." They stood for a moment, the wind lashing at the edges of their cloaks. Petyr turned as if to go, then paused, his voice dropping. "Your aunt's mind is not always steady," he said, choosing his words carefully. "She can be reasoned with, but do not provoke her, and do not let slip anything that might inflame her jealousy." Sansa nodded mutely. Her mind flashed back to how close she had come to death. She had lost too many illusions to think she was truly safe, no matter Petyr's vows. But at least, for the moment, she was alive and not betrothed to some monster. Even if her situation was precarious, it was more stable than King's Landing had been. Petyr's gaze lingered a moment longer. Then he offered a curt nod and walked off the terrace, presumably to rejoin Lysa or to set some small plan in motion. Left alone, Sansa exhaled, half wondering how her life might have changed if Petyr had gone through with that final push. Lysa Arryn would be dead, and Petyr would be free to rule the Vale through the boy Robert. But he hadn't done it. Perhaps he had decided that controlling Lysa was more advantageous than discarding her corpse. Only time would reveal whether that choice would prove wise or disastrous. The Vale lords began to gather a fortnight after Petyr and Lysa's wedding, for many had been unable to attend the hurried ceremony. Lysa insisted that they host a belated wedding feast, a display of the union that now held dominion over the Vale. Ravens had winged their way to the High Harpies, the gates of the moon, and beyond, delivering invitations stamped with the moon and falcon sigil. One by one, the lords and ladies arrived, ascending the dizzying mountain paths or carried in litters by sure-footed mules. Among them came Lord Yon Royce of Runestone, a tall man with a strong jaw and a reputation for blunt honesty. Ser Vance Corbray, representing House Corbray, arrived as well, his brother Lionel the nominal head of the house but overshadowed by Vance's skill in arms. From the Red Forts to the Belmores, they all arrived to show respect and weigh the new regime. Sansa, standing beside Petyr in the high hall as Lysa greeted them, tried to keep her head bowed, playing the role of a dutiful bastard daughter. Her mind, though, was keenly aware of the discontent that simmered beneath the surface. Yon Royce, especially, had a reputation for disliking Petyr Baelish. He considered him a cunning upstart with no business ruling the Vale. Yet outwardly there was politeness, bowing to Lysa, exchanging courtesies with Petyr, all while Sansa suspected the man's keen eyes tracked every subtlety. That evening, the wedding feast was held in the Great Hall, a space smaller than some of the grand halls in larger castles, yet opulent in its own airy and lofty style. The high ceiling soared overhead, overshadowed only by the mountains themselves. Torches and braziers created a warm glow against the white stone walls. The distant sound of wind funneling around the battlements gave the occasional haunting moan, a reminder that they perched atop the world. Robert Arryn was brought out of his chambers, propped up in a chair near his mother and stepfather, though the boy looked pale and hardly touched his food. Lysa fussed over him, pressing him to take more spoonfuls of stew, while Petyr turned his attention to their guests, playing the gracious host. He charmed the ladies with compliments, inquired after the lords' households, asked about any matters of concern in their lands. He spun a tapestry of courtesy that sought to bind them, if not in friendship, then in carefully modulated goodwill. Sansa watched, occasionally forced to interact when someone inquired about Petyr Baelish's lovely bastard daughter. She answered in soft, demure tones, as Petyr had instructed her. In truth, it was not so different from her old training at Winterfell and King's Landing. She knew how to curtsy and smile, how to say nothing of importance while sounding polite. Yet she missed her family, her home, the honesty she once took for granted. She had glimpsed the savage underbelly of politics, and now she stood on a precarious ledge, hoping the next gust would not send her tumbling into emptiness. Amid the feast, Yohn Royce rose and offered a toast to Lady Lysa and Lord Baelish. He spoke of his hope that the Vale would remain strong and united. His words were measured, but Sansa perceived an undercurrent of challenge. Would Petyr truly remain a steward of House Arryn's best interests, or was he only elevating himself at the Vale's expense? Petyr, for his part, thanked Yohn graciously, weaving a response that flattered the old knight's honor and reputation. After the formalities, the hall resumed its noisy chatter. Sansa noticed Lysa fiddling with her goblet, eyes occasionally darting in Sansa's direction. The older woman's expression vacillated between a tense smile and nervous suspicion. Perhaps Lysa recalled the ugly jealousy that had driven her to nearly murder Sansa. Perhaps she sensed her hold on Petyr was not absolute. Or perhaps she simply found it difficult to trust anything where Petyr was concerned, after so many years of longing, fear, and heartbreak. Even so, she remained outwardly composed, determined to appear the gracious lady of the Vale. The feast lasted for hours, and by the time the servants cleared the last courses, Sansa felt exhausted. She longed for her bed, or for some corner of quiet. But formalities demanded that she remain in view until Petyr excused her. At last, near midnight, the gathering disbanded. Many guests retired to their chambers, while some lingered in smaller groups, exchanging tidbits of gossip and discussion about the Vale's future. Sansa noticed Yohn Royce glancing at her as he left, a flicker of curiosity in his steady gaze. It made her uneasy, but she kept her composure. Petyr took Lysa's arm, guiding her toward the corridor that led to her private chambers. As they walked away, Lysa cast a single backward glance at Sansa. It was not as openly hostile as it had been days earlier, but it was far from warm. Then they disappeared, leaving Sansa alone under the watchful eyes of a few guards and serving girls. Feeling unsteady, she turned on her heel and proceeded to her own small chamber. There, she collapsed into bed, uncertain what new intrigues the morrow would bring, or if Lysa's precarious sanity would threaten her again. For now, she took such peace as she could in her unsteady circumstances. Days turned to weeks. The Vale lords, many of them reluctant to take their leave too soon, lingered in the Eyrie or at the gates of the moon below. They sought to judge Petyr's capacity for leadership, all while pressing him for minor favors or decisions that might benefit their own positions. Petyr, unsurprisingly, reveled in these negotiations. He had spent much of his life in the intrigues of King's Landing and had honed his skill at reading men and shaping events. Under Petyr's direction, Lysa wrote letters reaffirming the neutrality and independence of the Vale, but she also alluded to the possibility that they might come to the aid of the crown if the terms were right. No outright declaration of support for Tommen Baratheon was made, but a gentle suggestion that the Vale remained open to alliance. Sansa watched from a distance, suspecting that Petyr was positioning himself to be the key broker between the Vale and whichever faction he deemed most profitable. Lysa, for her part, seemed lulled into a state of uneasy calm. She indulged in the presence of the Vale lords, presiding over small gatherings and listening to their concerns about mountain clans harassing trade routes, about the struggles of winter snows that had begun to settle on higher passes. She would nod gravely, promise them that the Vale would remain strong and stable, then turn to Petyr for the details of how that might be accomplished. Petyr's mind for finance and strategy became her crutch. On good days, she would beam at him, proclaiming how grateful she was to have such a capable husband at her side. On bad days, She would fix him with a suspicious glare, corners of her mouth turned down, and ask pointed questions about Sansa's presence. "I do not like how she looks at you," she snapped once in private, in a voice loud enough that Sansa overheard from the corridor. "She is a child," Petyr said smoothly, exasperation creeping into his tone. "You must allow her the presence she's owed as my bastard daughter. That is the only story that protects her from the Lannisters. Or would you have them believe we are harboring a Stark girl?" Lysa huffed, but the mention of the Lannisters silenced her complaints. "Very well," she muttered, "but keep her from my sight more often. I cannot abide those Tully looks, always reminding me of Cat." Sansa's heart lurched at that. If Lysa felt threatened by the mere resemblance to Catelyn Tully, there was no telling what might happen if her moods swung dangerously. But Petyr was still, for whatever reason, determined not to kill Lysa, not to slip that final dagger into her back. Perhaps he found her paranoia useful, or perhaps he wanted to maintain the illusion of a stable house Arryn, led by the proper lady of the Vale. He kept his serpent's tongue at the ready, soothing Lysa's suspicions whenever they threatened to boil over. And so, the household continued in an uncertain harmony. The Vale lords, while not entirely charmed by Petyr, found him more cooperative than they had expected. He allowed them input on certain matters, listened gravely to their suggestions, and made no move to dispatch armies or meddle in their internal affairs. Yohn Royce, though still wary, appeared to adopt a wait-and-see attitude. He spent his days tutoring young knights in the courtyard or speaking with the other lords about the future. In the meantime, Sansa's life took on a strange routine. She would break her fast with the rest of the household, often in Lysa's presence, then spend hours in the solar, sewing or reading, carefully avoiding any behavior that might trigger her aunt. She had some small respite with Robert, telling him stories, but the boy was frequently too ill to enjoy them. Occasionally, Petyr summoned her to discuss some trivial matter, or to practice her courtesies with visitors. Then, one evening, word came of fresh conflict in the Riverlands. Reports suggested that the remnants of the war still raged in pockets, that outlaws roamed the roads, that wolves howled in the night. Sansa's heart clenched at the mention of wolves. She thought of her lost siblings, scattered or dead, of her father's execution. The Ravens also brought news that the Ironborn had pressed their advantage on the coasts, though King's Landing's new regime under the young King Tommen claimed to be negotiating peace with them. None of it felt fully real within the lofty perch of the Eyrie. After the Ravens arrived, Petyr conferred with Lysa behind closed doors. A short while later, the two emerged, wearing sober expressions. Petyr summoned Yohn Royce, Ser Vance Corbray, and a few other notable Vale lords to the High Hall for a private audience. Sansa, as usual, was excluded, but she was permitted to stand near the door as a silent observer. Ostensibly because she was Petyr's bastard, but in truth, perhaps he wanted her to learn. So she listened as Petyr explained that they must prepare the Vale's knights to respond to any potential threat crossing the mountains. Lysa nodded along, adding that House Arryn would not be bullied or pressed. The lords, exchanging uncertain glances, agreed that defending the Vale from incursion was paramount. "We must seal the Bloody Gate more securely," Petyr said. "Ensure that no large force can slip into our mountains without us knowing. A small garrison of knights, hand-selected, will suffice. Let us rotate them to keep them fresh." Yohn Royce tapped his chin. "And do we mean to march beyond the mountains, Lord Baelish? The Riverlands are still in disarray." Petyr flicked his eyes to Lysa, who offered a thin smile. "For now, we remain in the Vale," she said. "We do not commit to open war, not yet. We shall watch and we shall wait." The older lords murmured their agreement, though Sansa could sense that at least some of them would have preferred a more decisive stance. The truth was, the Vale stood strong while the other regions had bled themselves. If a single force were to unite the Vale Knights, they could potentially change the course of the war. But for now, Lysa and Petyr had decided it wasn't time. When the meeting ended, the lords dispersed. Sansa lingered a moment, her mind roiling with the knowledge that beyond these mountains, chaos still reigned. She worried for her sister Arya, for her half-brother Jon. though she wasn't entirely sure where they were or if they even lived. But she had to push that aside as Petyr approached, smiling in that mysterious way he had. "You listened well," he murmured to her. "But keep your thoughts to yourself, my dear. This is a dangerous game." Sansa lowered her eyes. "I understand, my lord." He squeezed her hand lightly. "Good girl." Just then, Lysa emerged from the shadows, fixing Sansa with a narrowed gaze. Petyr slipped away to greet her, leaving Sansa to wonder once more if the next shift in Lysa's mood might undo them all. As the moon waxed and waned beyond the high castle walls, winter's chill settled more firmly on the mountains. The roads grew icy, and in some places impassable. Most of the Vale lords departed for their own lands, wishing to see to their harvests and maintain their households before the snows deepened. A smaller retinue remained at the Eyrie, while others took up residence at the Gates of the Moon, the castle at the mountain's base, where conditions were more manageable. Petyr and Lysa, however, stayed firmly ensconced at the Eyrie, partly because Lysa refused to leave,